Hey, MBA hopefuls. We are on the air live with MBA Waves, your weekly vidcast talking all things business and education, streaming live every Tuesday on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube, bringing you tons of tips to help you get into top-ranked MBA programs and getting you up close and personal with many of these schools that we host on the show, where you can get all your questions answered. And if you like this week's episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Today on episode 96, we're talking about the GMAT, top 10 myths about the GMAT. We're going to get into everything from the new format of the GMAT that's come out to some tricks and tips that'll help you along the journey, and it is a journey. As always, I'm your host, Eric Lucrezia, joined by my co-hosts, Bara Sapir and Krithika Srinivasan. Hey, guys.
Hello. Good to see you.
Good to see you, too. Good to see you, too. And this week, we are joined... This week, we are joined by Travis Morgan, our friend and colleague, also an AGAC member. And
True.
I'll just take a quick second to mention AGAC, what that's all about, the Association for International Graduate Admissions Consultants. We are an organization that vets and, in a way, kind of certifies admissions consultants all around the world to make sure you get somebody great and professional to work with you and have success throughout your admissions journey. And we have an applicant fair, an online fair. AGAC is sponsoring or hosting an applicant fair online this May 26th. Do I get the date right?
I'm not on the conference committee, so I don't know.
May 26th, and you can find that on the AGAC website. That's agac.org. Without further ado, let me let Travis introduce himself a little bit more. How you doing, Travis?
I'm doing great. And if there's three people who make me happy, it's the three that I'm joined with right here. So I'm really happy to be with you guys.
Happy to have you too. Thanks. Yeah. So look, guys, let's get into it right away, all about the GMAT. And let me just say, unless you've been living under a rock the last couple of weeks or month or so, you've probably heard that GMAC, right, the people that make the GMAT, have recently announced a new format of the GMAT called the Focus Edition. So we're going to talk all about that soon, but let's first dive into some myths, and we'll get into exactly what the Focus Edition is about from what we know so far. So who wants to dive into the first myth that we can perhaps debunk?
Well, before we talk about the myth, I want to talk about the fact that their branding of it is super interesting, right? Like, I mean, and to talk about like why they're coming up with this new test, right? And I think it's super interesting because their other labels for the test names aren't as I don't know if I'd say forward or the fact that it's got focus in the name is pretty brilliant. Don't you guys think that's amazing? Because it's really getting the attention of the test taker immediately. Yeah, I mean, focus. Obviously, focus, take the GMAT. I think it's actually a pretty brilliant marketing protocol that they're doing. The GRE does not have any kind of special name that I know of. And other editions of the GMAT, it's basically executive assessment and just the regular GMAT. So I think it's actually, wouldn't you have loved to be a fly in the room of that? Kind of name it.
I think it really emphasizes the fact that the test is shorter, right? So they know that this is a key drawback to the GMAT is that it is longer than the GRE, and that it is it takes a ton of stamina to take the test currently. So almost an hour shorter, right? In that Focus Edition. Bara, if I had to speculate, I would imagine that this is temporary branding, as the two tests are going to overlap for a short time. That's true. Then as they drop the other one, my guess is that the Focus Edition is just going to become the GMAT.
It'll fade off and it'll come back to just the GMAT. Interesting. Yeah. What also I think is interesting is that it starts to resemble a bit more the EA or the executive assessment, right? Because as it's like, the EA is it's about an hour and a half, right? And this is 2.25.
This is
now the new Focus
sections, yeah.
Right. Yeah, 3 45-minute sections, which comes out to 2.25, 2 hours and 15 minutes. Also similar to or same as the EA, there's no written part, there's no AWA, there's no geometry anymore, and there's a couple more similarities. And when I was talking to one of the reps at a recent MBA fair here in Paris, who works for GMAC. I was like, oh, is this meant to kind of replace no, they're going to maintain the two different things according to her. But I don't know what's down the pipeline, but I think it's very interesting that the two have actually become more and more similar.
It is.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this really is like the EA-ification of the GMAT, which I think is a wildly positive move. I've long thought that the EA among these three exams of the GMAT, the GRE, and the EA is actually the best indicator of someone's true ability. It strips out a lot of the who's the best test taker and gets to your true ability. And I'm super bullish on the new Focus edition of the GMAT. By the way, I think it's a great improvement.
I think it's going to be interesting because I know that on Reddit and on some of the social media channels, they are talking about, I mean, they haven't said there's no geometry, but we're just not seeing it in some of the materials that they put out. We're also not seeing people are also speculating that there's not going to be sentence correction, but it's speculation because it might show up in a different way. Like you might be able to, I don't know how they're going to do it. It's just it wasn't on the table of contents that they posted on Amazon. So a bunch of people, including myself, on a article that I wrote, I highlighted, wow, this isn't on there, but we don't know for sure yet. So we're going to have to wait and see. But that is the speculation.
To my understanding, Bara, oh, go ahead, Krithika. I think you maybe just touch delayed, but go ahead.
Yeah. So I was just saying that, I think that a lot of the people are already thinking that, hey, it's going to be 1 hour late, lesser. So I'm going to try to probably take the GMAT when it comes. And many are saying that it may come in fall, or it may, it may come to know about that. So that is like another interesting aspect. Already people who are applying or are thinking of taking that test because it shaves off so much time.
Yeah, I like Marlena's note here, like light or LITE, like either one would be fun. Like that would actually be a great AGAC like parody, right? If we did a like a funny, I don't know. I'll bring it to the board.
Bring it to the board. All right, are we going to talk GMAT myths or what?
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
All right, Krithika, I vote for you to bring up the first myth if you're into it.
All right. Yeah, and this is one of my favorites too. They say a good GMAT score is proof of someone's and memory power.
All right, I think there was a little bit of choppy sound.
And I would say, absolutely not, because
I think there was a little bit of delay in the sound. I'm just going to repeat it.
Sorry, please go ahead.
A good GMAT score is proof of my memory power and intelligence was the first myth. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
Take it away, Krithika.
Yeah, and I'm going to yeah. So I'm going to say this is one of my favorite ones.
Bara, you want to finish it up for Krithika? Because it's like,
well, it's a funny thing because, all standardized tests are a measure of both what you know and how well you take the test. So in part, I wouldn't call it proof of memory because there's a lot of things. There are things that you need to understand and memorize, like the equations and how to do things. Intelligence, questionable. It really is it's a reasoning test, and it's how you move through the questions with what you know. So it's kind of like if you're playing a game of tennis or you're learning how to play tennis, you're going to learn the rules, and you're going to learn how to hit the ball a certain way and how to play that game. But when you're actually in the game, you don't go through your Rolodex of what you know of how to play tennis. You're actually in it. So it's like, how do you MacGyver the GMAT, right? Like, how do you work through with what you've got? Because you're not going to be tested specifically on what you've memorized. You're going to use what you've memorized. So it's reasoning, it's critical thinking, and it's what business schools want to know. They're like, how are you going to work through a really complex situation in logistics, right? How are you going to move through it? And so the test, I believe, emulates that. The test is pulling you through it. What do you think, Travis?
First of all, I have not used the tennis analogy, but I may steal that from you, Bara. So, and I didn't really give an introduction, but I actually am both a long time, I've taught the GMAT for 15 years as a tutor, in addition to my admissions consulting stuff that I do. And so I actually think that in the wording of the myth that here, a good GMAT score is proof of my memory power and intelligence. That is very dangerous myth, right? That, so this, it falls under this kind of fixed mindset that I have like this fixed amount of memory power and intelligence, and the GMAT is just sort of laying that bare, right? And so if I get a bad score, I must not be very smart, I must not have a great memory, things like this. It's just not true. It's just not true, right? Yeah. And so we have to be really careful of that. Yeah, we've got to build these fundamentals, as Bara is saying, the swing and doing all this practice and whatnot. But there's a lot more to it than just that, right? That's just the foundation.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And it's funny. I think you brought up a really important point, Travis, which is the fixed mindset, because the opposite of that, or the complement to that, is a growth mindset, right? And really, living one's best life is having a growth mindset, because it means you're not in that box that you talked about, right? It's about seeing that as you learn, and even as you learn on the mistakes that you make as you're practicing for the GMAT, for whatever, for the tennis game, it's an opportunity to get better. It's an opportunity to deepen. It's an opportunity to evolve. And so, because we're living in an ever-changing world, being able to change and be resourceful and have the grit is really going to allow you not only to produce your best, but to feel your best, right? So that fixed mindset that you're talking about with proof, I think, is a really good, it's a good like hashtag, fixed mindset versus growth mindset.
And I'm a huge believer in growth mindset. I also believe that it's important to realize a lot of people think like, oh, I'm preparing for the GMAT, and that's completely divorced from business school itself. I genuinely believe, I went to Kellogg myself, and I genuinely believe that your preparation for the GMAT gets you ready for day one of business school so that you can hit the ground running. And a lot of people don't really carry that mindset with them either. It's just this kind of hurdle that I need to get over so that I can get to business school, and those two things are totally separate. I actually think that the preparation of one definitely supplements the preparation for the other.
A lot of people, as an admissions consultant, I agree with you, Travis, 100%, that a lot of people, we say that the GMAT is like your first MBA class. And I would say like writing your essays and all the other stuff you do as far as your application is kind of like your first career services event. You're laying out the map for your future, right? You're bridging the gap from yourself today to the future version of yourself, speaking about goals in the short, medium, and long term, speaking about function, sector of business you want to work in, and geography, like where you want to end up. And so all of these components that, as you say, people might see as divorced from business school itself are actually some of the best primers that you can take advantage of to get there, and to not just get there, but to come out of business school, right? Because it's not just about getting in, it's about what lays ahead of you. It's just the beginning.
Yeah, and I would actually build on that, Eric, and say that it's not even just the GMAT, but it's also how you're preparing, how you're getting your application together, who you're hiring, how you're hiring admissions consultants to help you, how you're preparing for things. Like I spoke to a potential client this week who's gotten like 2 big online courses, and he told me it's taken him 6 months to get through half of the material on one of the courses. And I'm like, well, how has that impacted your score? And he's like, not so great. And I'm like, okay, well, what are you doing next? And he's like, well, I want to go through the rest of it. I'm like, but this is a business school equation. Are you going to spend another 6 months on the other material if you haven't done as well as you want? Like, if that was a business school question, what is that telling you? So it's like this whole process. And we've often talked about this. Like I look at it, it's like a fractal of the business school, which is a fractal of life, right? Like how we do some things is how we do all things. So, I posited to this person, you might want to think about getting someone to streamline your efforts if that's of value to you. Like if time is of value, if it's not, then do it the way you're doing it. You're going to get, everyone could probably get most of the way to where they need to go if they do things on their own. But to save the time, the money, the energy, and then actually, statistically score better because you bring in professionals, better essays because you bring in people to give you feedback. That's a business equation right there, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I think this leads us to the next myth, Eric, this idea of timeline. Shall we introduce it?
Yes, go for it, Travis.
So the GMAT can be cracked in 3 weeks. I will tell you that there are people out there where, you can study for 2-3 weeks. They go and take the test. They get the score they want, and they go. This is a very dangerous thing to be reading online and having that be your expectation, though, because that is extremely rare, right? Even as someone who now teaches the exam, when I was studying for the exam myself, and even as someone who is a good test taker, right? Someone who likes taking tests, it was many more weeks for me to get up to the score that I'm looking for. So I think that's a very dangerous myth.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one out of 100,000 can pull that off. Maybe. I mean, it's so few people. I think you'd be a very foolish person to put your money on you being able to do that. You can try, but you better not do it with no, buffer of a couple of months to actually give the typical range of time need to prepare properly for the test.
I think the preparation, what people don't realize is that you might be able to learn everything that's on the test, but you have to integrate it and then you have to show up for it. And that's like your brain needs time to do that integration.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of out of your control to some extent. You can learn it, that's conscious, but the unconscious part of really having it become part of you is what takes the time. So
and also taking it in the conditions of being in a test center where you're probably more stressed, right? You have self-doubt, you have imposter syndrome, you have whatever feelings that come along with that, that knowing you're being examined. It's not a rehearsal.
Yeah, but those things can be dealt with. Those things, like I deal with those things with clients. We deal with that.
But that takes time.
It takes time, but that's actually the quickest thing to get over. But if people don't take the step to get over it, it doesn't disappear.
Right.
Period.
Right.
But you actually have to be an active participant in your evolution.
Totally.
An offshoot of this myth, by the way, is that because the GMAT gives me 16 days between test taking, that I can magically improve my score by significant amounts, 50 points, 80 points, 100 points in those 16 days. It's very unlikely. Yeah, it's very unlikely. The only time where I've seen where my students see a very dramatic jump in 16 days or somewhere there too is when they severely underperformed their true ability on that first one, very often due to anxiety or the things that we've just been talking about, but that on practice exams, et cetera, that they scored much higher, so they know they have the potential, they just underperformed that. Sure, you can go back in and see a pretty dramatic change, but a lot of people will book 2 exams right away, one on one date and one 16 days later. I have not found that to be a successful strategy.
So when you see a reasonably big jump after the 16 days, it's because it's been an anomaly. It's an anomaly based on what the level really is at that point, and they just swept up because of nerves or something. Right?
Yeah, or they blew the timing or something like this. But that's another kind of sub myth here, is that it can be cracked in 3 weeks and it can be re-cracked in 3 weeks.
Why do you think GMAC has made that part of their
16-day thing?
Their structure?
If I had to speculate, Bara, it's that they have a finite number of questions that are in, and they kind of rotate those questions through the official thing, and so you cannot. If you were to take it every day or every other day or something like that, they would literally run out of questions for you to serve you in this adaptive test. That's my speculation.
Right, but
What
days,
longer?
I would agree
like,
that.
why not longer? Like, why would they set people up for failure, essentially?
Oh, now you're getting into my cynical side, but it's like, hey,
Bring it.
people want it. People want it, right? They've got only a month between now and those round 2 deadlines, and they just took a test on December 1st or something, and they didn't get the score they want, and they want the opportunity to get another test in before the deadline. I think, yeah.
We have to
the
get
test is their product, right? It's a product for
Right.
GMAC, so that's
It's
how
a
they get their
product.
revenue.
And well, the question is, who is their client? Is it the schools, or is it the people who are taking the test? Where are they actually both are? We have to
Right.
get GMAC on. We need to grill them about this, man.
Taking the stand, we have GMAC.
We've had
I
ETS.
would say it's purely
GMAC.
operational, I would say it's purely logistics and operational stuff, but it's so important for some of the students to have this ability to take the test again, because they feel that, many times, and this is like a funny story I wanted to say. There isn't actually a client who did crack it in 3 weeks, but that was his second attempt. So, the myth that like you could crack your first attempt in 3 weeks is literally a myth. I've hardly had anybody do it. And even if they did it, they were people who literally like did nothing else for the entire 3 weeks. And that's how they went for the exam. But I would say that this is all because of operational logistics more so. But I also wanted people to have this safety net of having this ability to take the exams again, where this was basically for helping them to accelerate their preparation. For some reason they couldn't spend as much time on it in the first attempt, and they would want to have this dedicated time. And that's why we could still see some results and some improvements happening in the second time, or in the 16 days that happens, right? So it's just that you're focusing more. But yeah, it's a very interesting question to ask GMAC.
Well, I also think that there's this therapeutic model that it's called exposure therapy. And the more you expose yourself to the thing that is uncomfortable or that you don't feel good in, like, that actually could have a role in this as well. I don't think GMAC is making that position. They're not in that positioning, but I do think that for a student, if they have a fear and if they haven't worked on it, the mere act of going in and just steeping in that experience allows the next time for many, it just makes it easier because it's known. It's not a mystery. It's not weird. And so the exposure therapy aspect, or through that lens, I think can be helpful. But it depends, like, exactly what you started with, Travis. Like, it depends on why they didn't do well in the first.
That's right.
So.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to the next myth, because we're burning through this episode with really good commentary, but I want to get to some of these other myths. So, if I may, a 760 plus GMAT score means a guaranteed admit to any M7 or equivalent schools. What do you guys have to say about that? Top score like 760 or higher out of 800? Is that a guarantee? Computer says no. Travis says no. All right, Travis, lay it down for us. Why not?
Real quick, so this is one data point, and so the schools are looking for the next generation of leaders, and the next generation of leaders does not necessarily mean that you are this, incredible genius, right? There are a lot of other, elements to your application, and so 760 plus puts you in what I call must consider category, right? That yes, they are going to take a look at your application, but then the other elements of the application have got to show that you're going to be that next generation of leaders.
Yeah. And also, I mean, I totally agree. And it's great. And it's it's almost like a gatekeeper score. It's like, it allows you to not be flagged or dinged, but it's not necessarily going to be your gateway in. If you're looking at like tests like the MCAT and tests like the LSAT, those are scores that the schools really are like, they can accept you with a certain score and not necessarily look as much at your whole person. I mean, they still do, but with the GMAT and every single AdCom that I've talked to, it's really, they're looking at the whole picture. So, you know, you could score a really low score, but if you're the Dalai Lama, you're probably going to get accepted to business school. But there's not that many Dalai Lamas. So,
Yeah.
so.
You know, and I always often come back to, like, you know, the GMAT does not measure anything about your ability to get along with other people, to inspire and lead other people. It doesn't measure anything about your international experience, for sure. Any kind of soft skills is not there. So there's a certain level of business acumen that the GMAT aims to measure, to assess using the medium of, you know, math and verbal questions and so forth. But it, you know, I think it's something that you can train for. Good thing you have people like Bara and Travis out there who work on that with you, but it is not everything. And so, as you said, it is kind of a must consider thing, but they need to know that you can communicate, that probably it's going to come down to an interview to see.
Empathy might be kind of a nice thing to throw in.
Right. Absolutely.
I will just add that on the flip side of this, when I did some quantitative analysis a few years back on the schools, almost across the board, if you were 35 points below the school's average, you were in the bottom 10th percentile of admitted students. That still means that 10% of people get in, but they need to have a very compelling reason to bring you in over someone with stronger stats, right? And most of us, quite frankly, do not have that. So, you know, yeah, it's a pretty tight band around the school's averages. Yeah, so I just wanted to throw that out there.
And it's one of the only things on your application that you can actually do something about in a very short period of time, relatively speaking. So it's actually another great business decision to actually put energy towards getting your score as high as it can be.
And you know what? This brings up another myth that's down the list, further down the list. But a lot of people worry about taking the test again. Oh, they're going to see you did poorly the first time around. I'm like, no, that is not a bad thing. I mean, every admissions committee I've spoken to is actually impressed with the fact that you're willing to take the time and energy and money, by the way, to invest on improving yourself. And in this case, your score. It speaks very much to your character. So I think all of us would agree, when you're planning your calendar of your admissions journey, plan to take it twice, because you're probably going to want to. Even if you get a 7 something the first time around, why not see if you can do better the second time around? More than 16 days of preparation, of course. After
everything is able to be looked at and thought about. So taking it more, like 2 times, 3 times, great. So
yeah. All right. What about this myth about the GRE? A lot of people have this idea that the GRE is easier than the GMAT. What do you guys think? My test prep experts.
Bara, you want to kick us off on this? Sure. I have thoughts. But,
sure, you have thoughts. Well, what I'd say is that because everyone who's coming to the test as an individual, that the only way that you know if something is easy or not is if you actually take a diagnostic and see if for you one of the tests is easier or not. We had a couple folks from ETS, right? MT and J came on and they're like, it is not easier. It is not an easier test. And for some people do find it easier. And some people just honestly believing they think it's easier makes them think that it's easier, but it's not actually. I mean, some of the math might be arguably easier. And for some people, grammar, which is more prevalent on the GMAT, might be more difficult. And vocabulary, which is on the GRE, might be easier for some people, especially when you look at people for whom English is not their first language. The way they learned the language might have an impact on how well they do on each of these tests. But I wouldn't say that it's easier, but they're different tests, right? And they test differently. And so who you are and how you go through the test. I mean, I often say the GRE is like the SAT on steroids, right? And so it's really which is easier for you. It doesn't matter if everyone is saying it's easier. Take it and see if it's easier for you.
You know, some people are better at juggling. Some people are better, I don't know, riding a unicycle. You can't just say one is easier than the other. You got to try what works for you.
Exactly. Travis, what do you think?
A couple of thoughts. So number one, yeah, a lot of times we hear that the GRE quant is easier. I will say that the topics tested are nearly identical in the quant from between the GRE and the GMAT, with just little minor differences. However, I do think that the GRE, the way they test quant, is more straightforward. And so people who tend to be more linear thinkers, right? People who are like, just give me a problem and tell me to solve it, and I solve it. They do tend to find the GRE quant more straightforward for them and easier to tackle. That said, for most of my students, they think that the GRE verbal is harder than GMAT verbal. And this may actually, with the GMAT focus, become even more so, because the challenge that most people have on the GMAT verbal that gives them a lot of heartburn is sentence correction, and that's going away, in GMAT focus. And so this could change the equation quite a bit, quite frankly, on what people consider to be easier and harder. The other thing I would mention is currently under the current scores, U.S. News and World Report, which is the ranking that weights test scores the most out of it. And most of the other rankings do not rank test scores at all in the rankings. They do a kind of an unusual thing. They rank it by the percentile of the sections, because the GRE does not have an overall score, right? It only has the individual scores for each section. So to try to create apples to apples, they do that. I will tell you that it is, quote unquote, easier to get a higher percentile on the quant on the GRE than it is on the GMAT. And so, when I'm coaching my students and we think that they're going to underperform the school's average, the GRE is a better test, to get a low score on than the GMAT, because the percentiles are kinder to you. And so the schools are able to admit people with a lower GRE, a sort of quote unquote lower GRE score, because the percentile isn't so bad. There's a whole bunch into this as far as like in the last decades, the demographic change of people taking the GMAT and why the GMAT's quant percentiles are so deflated. I mean, you can get an incredibly strong score on the GMAT quant and have a pretty bad looking percentile. That does not mean that you perform poorly. So there are some nuances here regarding, is the GMAT GRE easier? The bottom line is no. Right, depends on who you are. It is not an easier test, but there may be some advantages for certain types of people, GRE versus GMAT.
I want to say two things. One, yes, all of it. Also, the thing that I find really challenging with the GRE is the fact that some questions don't have one answer.
Yeah.
And that is kind of a mind F. So not like, whereas the GMAT, there's only one answer per question. Yep. I think that it actually is a little unnerving to have multiple answers for some of the verbal questions. I was also going to say something about the GRE is also used in graduate programs, right? So it's not an exclusive business school test. And so even though it's used by business schools, by most business schools now, it's when they create the test, they have to have in mind, and I think that straightforwardness that you're talking about, Travis, is really indicative of that. It's not just business school students or business school hopefuls that are taking the test. And so you have chemistry, comp lit, archaeology, anthropology. You've got different majors of folks that are taking the test to get into grad school. And so I still think that it's a reasoning test, and there's things that are similar to the GMAT in that sense and critical thinking, but it just is a much bigger umbrella of who's taking it. So, and I think that is reflected in the construct.
So how to also add that you mentioned a point about non-native speakers. I think that they find the GRE much more straightforward, like how Travis mentioned. That's because you could easily memorize vocabulary or like learn it much better than probably applying rules of grammar. in the GMAT versus GRE. And the other thing about GRE is, as you said, it's very easy to score a 170 on the GRE, and there are a lot of engineers out here who want to try to do it. But what I like about GRE versus GMAT for many other people is the flexibility it offers. Some of them are very confused about choosing B school or probably going to grad school, or and if you choose GMAT, you'll have to like kind of lock it in and make sure that you're only applying to B school. So from that angle, I think there are a lot more people who are leaning towards a GRE.
We love to be indecisive, don't we? Keep our options open.
Well, you know what? One of the unofficial tagline of MBA Waves is "It depends."
That's right.
Yeah, that's certainly there. Well, I can put up another one, a myth, and see what y'all think. The GMAT needs advanced, crazy math skills like engineering. Myth or truth?
100% myth. Yeah. So, and the topics are pretty well laid out in the GMAC like official materials about the GMAT, and you'll see it is pretty basic arithmetic, algebra. It used to be geometry, but geometry is getting axed. Yeah, and it's not even you don't go into trigonometry, you don't go into any calculus, you don't go. It's even kind of basic high school math.
Yeah.
The only little caveats to that is. For some students, there is a topic called combinatorics, which is methods of saying how many different possible outcomes you have on this. You may never have done this before in your life, right? This may be a whole new, and probability. Yeah, so those are related.
If you go to Vegas, you can build.
That's right. So those, tend to give people a little more heartburn in terms of the learning of the material. I will say, though, by the way, that in my experience, it's these quote unquote more advanced topics where the questions are more straightforward, and you basically either know how to do it or you don't know how to do it. And it's the quote unquote easier topics, like the arithmetic and the algebra, where if you just tested someone on straight arithmetic, everyone would get it right? Like, you can't do that. So this is where the GMAT tends to make things a little trickier, if you will, quote unquote, right? That they make you use more higher order thinking and problem solving skills because the fundamental skill is actually too easy. So yeah, they end up being much harder questions for people, in the arithmetic and algebra, that they struggle with that even more than the quote unquote more advanced topics.
Absolutely. But think about it again with the growth mindset, that it's interesting, right? And it's fun. And that if you have these foundational skills, that you're just really building on them, which is, like it's a challenge, get your grit ready.
I like to say that the GMAT is not looking for the best mathematician on the quant, nor are they looking for the best grammarian on the verbal. They're looking for the best detective, the person who can kind of understand, okay, what is the problem here that we're trying to solve? What are the clues that have been laid? And then notice the things that other people don't notice, right? And make the connections to things that other people don't make the connections to. And those are skills that are learnable, right? Those are skills that we can grow in as well, beyond just the algebra and the combinatorics and the probability and the statistics.
Yeah, and that's kind of the skills that you want in B school. I mean, the real one too. That's what you see in everyday life. So I'm going to take it to the next one. See, it says that like you only need good vocabulary to ace the GMAT verbal section. Yes or no?
Not at all. I mean, that might be a myth for GRE, and it still wouldn't be true. But what I will say that you do, the kind of vocabulary you do need is also equally important on the math, like a word like difference, right? You really need to understand how difference really functions in a math question, because it doesn't function in regular parlance, right? The same way as it does in how they want you to understand it. So you do need to have good vocabulary in foundational what things mean, especially if English is not your first language. Like, how does that really function? And just to piggyback on what you said before, Krithika, if people's native language is not English, you can still lean into that in taking these tests, especially GRE, because so many languages and so much vocabulary is built on other languages, especially in English. And so you really can, wow, that sounds like that in my language. It's like, then go for it. If you have nothing else to go on, then trust that that French word or that Latin word or that Arabic word, right? Like copacetic is basically I think it's an old language. It's in Hebrew, kol baseder, right? So you can actually depend on the languages that you know, because we're in a multicultural, I don't know, it's a semiotic kind of world, right? So you can depend on that. What do you think, Travis, in terms of the vocabulary and GMAT verbal? Are you with me on that?
You know, on the GMAT in particular, I think when folks are where English is not their first language, they get a really nervous around the reading comprehension, you know, passage where you have a long passage to read. You have to answer multiple questions, often very detailed or very specific questions about that passage. It gives us a lot of anxiety. And I absolutely have worked, you know, with students who had a real challenge of even understanding what the passage was saying. But I always have them lean into, don't worry about what you don't understand. Just tell me what you do understand about this paragraph, right? And then just move on, right? Like, keep going. And you would be shocked at how much you really do. You know, even if you have no idea what this thing is talking about, but you're like, well, it's some theory about something I have no idea about. This person appears to be supportive of it. This person appears to be, you know, against it, whatever, like, you know, that sort of thing. Like, even a really basic understanding of this without understanding even the majority of the vocabulary in a passage, you can get a lot of questions right. You can get a lot of questions right. You know, so yeah, vocab is not something that I focus on really at all on the GMAT. It's other elements of our logical thinking and whatnot that will serve us well. I think in GMAT focus, this may become even more so, quite frankly, without the sentence correction.
I will say this is why MindFlow, the speed reading platform we just launched, is valuable, because it really allows people to get the general ideas and not get fixed. So I'll just give that little plug there, that reading faster will actually help you do better because you're not getting hooked and in the ways that you're talking about.
Great.
What's the next myth that we're going to go over here?
Oh, I'll introduce this one.
Go for it.
GMAT Focus Edition next year will be easier than the current GMAT. Oh, man. I'm opening a can of worms. Bara, do you want to kick us off on this one, too?
There's no reason at all to think that it's going to be easier. And if you've heard that, you need to question your source. It's not going to be easier. It's like the fact that it's shorter means that it's going to be more deliberate and more intense. And it's actually, it might be harder. It very well might be harder.
That's a good point that I hadn't thought about, Bara. But when you have a shorter section, you have less room for error, right? Like, you know, yeah, that every question counts more now than it did before, right? You know, so the other thing to be mindful of in standardized tests is this idea of easy. Like, it's all about percentiles, right? It's all about your peer group, right? You know, and so,
Exactly.
so if it's easier for you and it's easier for everyone else, then that doesn't help you in any way, right? You know, yeah. So that said, I do think that that they have been very mindful of looking at the element, and again, things like the geometry is being removed from the quant is speculation, right? You know, but I think based on what we've seen in the EA and in the materials that have been released so far, it's a pretty good bet that geometry is going to be gone. That has nothing to do with your ability to succeed in business school or in business. Like, it's the most divorced topic in the entire GMAT, and I'm happy to throw it in the garbage. And what that does is it does help you focus your preparation so that you don't, you know, you're not trying to just memorize all these, you know, areas and length of an arc and things like this. that you can focus on stuff that will actually translate into skills into business school. My opinion is the same of sentence correction in the verbal, is the least connected. No one is going to ask you as a business leader to correct these sentences.
Well, yeah. I mean, back in the office, I did that every day. We had to correct each other's sentences. So, I mean, like, it's not normal, you know. But you guys both brought up good points, you know. Just because it's shorter doesn't mean it's going to be easier. And if it's easier for you, it's going to be easier for everyone. So what a lot of people might not realize is that your scores are compared to the people with whom you take it on the same day. You want to break that down for people who are watching who may not realize how the GMAT is scored?
Well, it is on a rolling. Go ahead.
Sorry. Trav, you go. No, you go. You go.
It is. I mean, I mean, it's not literally just the same day. The percentiles are on a rolling 3-year basis, but you know, but it is. You get that score. The GMAT's pretty proud of the fact that your raw score on the quant and verbal sections are comparable basically across all time. You know, that your ability level of getting a 45 on quant today is the same as an ability level of getting a 45 on quant 20 years ago. But the percentiles shift, you know, and they're constantly shifting, you know, based on who's taking the test, you know, on a rolling basis. And so this matters. This matters. Yeah. And the overall score does shift just a little teeny tiny bit based on that quant verbal split. One thing that, you know, again, rumored, but
this comment from Marlena. if you can't get the question when it's 1 out of 20, you won't be able to answer it when it's 1 out of 10.
That's a very, very good point, Marlena. Wow. Absolutely. So
good comment.
So
you were saying, Travis.
We also have kind of rumored speculation on the score. It's a fascinating shift actually on the GMAT focus, where it looks like it's going to be scored on a nearly identical basis in terms of the overall score, 205 to 805, and on 10-point increments. So if you took the focus, your score will end in a 5. If you took the original, your score will end in a 0. So it'll be very easy to tell the difference between those two. I am shocked that if indeed that proves to be true, I am shocked that is the direction that they went, because it means that it's essentially still 200 to 800 point score on overall, but those two scores may not be comparable at all. You know, depending on how people do on this new format. So usually when a test makes a very, very significant shift, like the GRE did several years ago, they change the overall scoring system altogether so that those two scores cannot be compared. They purposely do it so that they cannot be compared. I'm surprised by this. Yeah.
Let me ask you guys a question, because back when I was in high school, I took the SATs, and I think it was also I think it was at a 1600, if I recall.
It went to 2400.
It went up to 2400, and then like 8 years later, it went back. So what is the likelihood of GMAC switching it back to the old way, pre-focus, back to 3.5 hours or 4, if we want to really go back?
I don't think it's going to switch. I think that we're all, like, our attention span has gotten shorter, and like I think it's really just a trend to make these things more finite. I mean, even the SAT is changing, and it's shorter. But I do also want to say something about scoring that's super important, is that the current GMAT has the writing section and it has the IR, the integrated reasoning. They're getting rid of both of those, and now there's this thing called data insights, which is supposedly going to be scored equally with the other two sections. So all of a sudden, like IR, where we worked with students on it, but it didn't really seem like it really impacted the acceptance or like their overall score, because it wasn't part of their 200 to 800, right? Now you have a whole new section that's probably a lot like IR, but it's getting much more prominence in the score. So that's really important, because now you just can't ignore it at all.
True. That is actually a really good point, Bara, in terms of prep as well, right? We basically had 2 sections that we used to really prep for and 2 sections that were throwaway. And now we have 3 sections that we need to prep for.
The truth comes out.
And we used to have, yes, a 3+ hour test, but we had an hour that was essentially throwaway. So actually, we now have a 2 hour and 15-minute test, all of which counts toward your overall score. So the amount of time of the test that counts toward your overall score is essentially the same.
Wow. MBA, hopefully
Yeah.
you guys are screwed. There's no more throwaway.
Yeah, for me, this reminds me of cricket, where they went from test cricket, which was like over 5 days something, to finally like one-day cricket, where they played it in one day, and then to finally like 2020 format, which is like very much shorter. But the interesting part is, like as you said, Travis, the prep changed. The kind of skills that you needed in order to excel in these different things change. But the good thing for us is we're not going to be playing GMAT tests or anything. It's just that we are just like probably giving the test like at one period of time or one point of time, which is like probably 3 to 6 months time window. So it's not going to change all the much. So yeah, but that brings me to the next myth. The GMAT is optional for most business schools. And we did see a lot of trend happening. Well, it went optional. But what do you guys think?
No, not most.
Not the ones.
We actually did an episode on test waivers a while back. MBA Waves did its thing on test waivers, and it's really interesting. I feel like a lot of it's optics. Like I feel a lot of like, even with the SAT being test optional, a school does not ask you to produce something if it's not important, right? They do not ask for something. And even if a school says something is optional or it's waived, like it's still going to have some precedence. And when we look at SAT scores, and even with test optional, most schools, even if they're optional, more people with test scores are getting accepted. Now, maybe we have to like get into the weeds a little bit more and say like, if you've got a score that's going to be good for your application and good for your candidacy, you want to include it.
Right. So, although on the flip side, if you have a score that is going to detract from your candidacy, and it's going to detract from your candidacy, and you do have a score waiver, use the score waiver. But this, I get asked this a lot on the admission side of my business, which is, do you see a trend of business schools moving away from standardized tests? I will tell you, I do not see that trend. I don't see it. Like not yet anyway. Even when we see it more so in undergrad and things like this, I do not see that. One of the things too is that U.S. News and World Report, in order to qualify for their ranking, there's a threshold. I don't know exactly what it is. Maybe 75% of your admitted students must have taken one of the tests, and so they cannot just give out test waivers willy-nilly. Yeah, like we saw in the beginning of the pandemic, because literally people could not take the test. That was sort of an exception. Yeah.
And from the applicant side, like it always does, it depends. It depends on the score you have produced. If you feel like it's going to be an added value to your overall application, then yes, of course, you want to submit that. If relative to your other elements in your application, like you've written great essays, you've had fantastic experiences, you interview well, then a weaker score would only be pulling you down compared to the other pieces that you've got to provide. So it depends, as always. We're almost at the end of the hour. Any final myths you want to add, or are we going to wrap it up there?
Well, one that we had added was it looks bad if you have to retake the GMAT, so you better do it right the first time. An absolute myth. Absolute myth. I know we've talked about this before, but I do want to emphasize this, is that and even schools themselves will say, yeah, take it up to 3 times, this sort of thing. I've pressed them on this question and saying, like, why do you recommend up to 3 times? And they say, oh, we just found that when people take it more than 3 times, they don't see an improvement. And I'm like, oh, well, I found that if they take it 3 times and then they come to me and we approach the test differently, they see a huge improvement. So, and they say, oh yeah, well, we don't mind as long as the score goes up. Take it. Plan to take it at least 2 times, but even taking it 4 or 5 times does not detract from your applications. In my experience, I've had applicants who've taken it many, many times, and they still get in to the top schools. So I would,
from the perspective of the school, I would just say that you tend to plateau unless you have a new strategy. If you have a different approach, such as working with a different coach or tutor, or you're doing it on your own, but if you keep on doing you've always been doing, you're going to keep on getting what you've always been getting, right? So if you change the approach, that changes everything.
I'd like to see that. Yeah, though it's a standardized test, there's no standard way of preparation for it. It's just like whatever suits different people. The test is standardized, but not the way that you approach it.
But I do want to say, like, I do think, and statistically, if you hire a coach to help you with the test, most people will improve the most. Like, that's really like, you'll actually improve if you it's like if you go to the gym with a trainer, you're going to actually perform better than if you just go to a class or if you just do it at home on your own. But that really also, just because you throw money at something doesn't mean you're going to improve. You have to apply yourself. So whatever you do, especially if you hire a trainer or a coach for GMAT or GRE, like, you actually have to do the work. You actually have to engage. Just because you hire someone does not mean you're going to improve if you don't do the work. So,
yeah, unless Travis or Bara writes a test for you.
There's only one indictment that I'm interested in today.
All right, we're not going to go there.
Oh, Bara.
Listen, thank you so much, Travis, for joining us today. This has been MBA Waves and Top 10 GMAT Myths. If you guys like this episode, be sure to give us a thumbs up. Ask any questions you want in the comments, and be sure to subscribe for future episodes. Join us next week on MBA Waves. We're going to be talking about AI, ChatGPT, and the challenge of admissions in this day and age. Thank you once again for joining us, and we'll see you next time. MBAwaves.com.
Bye, guys.
Bye.